Welcome everybody. Today I want to run through feed tests and try and look at what are the important results we get, particularly in the context of drought. There's a range of feed testing laboratories in Australia at the moment. Some deliver pretty simple looking test results or printouts, such as this one from the laboratory here at Wagga. Others you'll probably see have quite complicated and complex printouts which contain a lot of additional material. There are a number of points which really are critical for drought feeding or even production feeding, but if we go through these, you'll see the main ones that I want to talk about today: dry matter, protein content, and metabolizable energy. And the reason I want to talk about those in particular is metabolizable energy content is what determines growth and production potential of a feed. Protein, as we all know, is important, and protein needs to be in balance with the amount of energy that an animal receives to make sure you get the growth that you should be able to achieve and also to meet production targets. The next one is dry matter content, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. And also, just to be aware, while feed test results usually don't or produce mineral and vitamin results, we just need to make sure they're met. And in most cases, that's not a problem, but if you've got concerns, go and look up some feeding standards or get some information about what may be required in certain circumstances. A classic would be feeding grazing crops where certain minerals are known or can be in deficiency. Dry matter content. Dry matter content is everything that is left after we take out the water content of a feed. And it's important because within that dry matter is all the energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. While animals need water to survive, the water itself doesn't provide any nutrients to livestock. That's why we like to express all forage quality parameters, all results on a dry matter basis. And dry matter basis is what we need to predict and formulate diets. It's also how we compare feed costs. So for example, grain, 90% dry matter content or 10% moisture, hay 85 to 88, silage 35 to 40. Obviously, a kilo of grain is a lot more dry matter than a kilo of fresh silage or even a kilo of hay. But metabolizable energy is the energy that an animal consumes that it is able to use for maintenance, heat production, and for growing meat, milk, wool, or looking after a fetus. Every kilo of feed an animal consumes contains energy. Metabolizable energy is that component that they can use, and the component they can use is determined by how digestible that feed is. And we'll talk about digestibility a bit more. Now, in most cases, ME is the first limiting nutrient for ruminants. It limits what animals can achieve in terms of production, but it's also what is required for maintenance. And at the moment, when diets or people are formulating rations to maintain live weight, particularly of breeding animals, then ME is the most critical and important indicator of feed quality that they can use. An example here, and you can get lots of these. This is just predicted using GradsFeed. GradsFeed is just a software package that can be used to predict live weight gain given the quality of feed in pasture or supplements or even complete diets. As you can see there, as metabolizable energy goes from 7 to 12, and we talk about metabolizable energy in terms of megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. It's purely and simply a unit measure of energy content. For some people, think of it as just the same as calories, only the scale's different. You'll also see down the bottom there that digestibility is directly related to metabolizable energy. As digestibility goes up, the amount of energy in the feed that an animal can utilize also goes up. And what we've predicted here is as ME goes from 7 to 12, live weight change goes from about half a kilo loss almost up to about 1.8 kilo a day gain for a growing steer. So you can see there, ME growth is directly related. So in terms of digestibility, in this example, just changing digestibility by 1% gives you effectively another 74 grams per day gain in animals. Digestibility is related to ME is related to digestibility, and essentially digestibility is the proportion of feed dry matter consumed that is not excreted as feces. Therefore, it's pretty obvious. This is just a picture, a diagram. If an animal eats 10 kilos of dry matter, there is 3 kilos of dry matter in the feces, then that feed is 70% digestible. And that 70% digestible feed is absorbed by the animal and utilized for growth, maintenance, lactation, and milk production. ME content and digestibility therefore go hand in hand, but they also vary between pasture types or crop types, and also between the stage of maturity of pasture types and crop types. It's worth knowing that as plants mature from that vegetative stage, go through that flowering, and in the case of crops up to a grain filling stage, you generally reduce digestibility and ME content. The exception can be crops like barley and wheat, where grain production may offset some of that decline later on. But word of caution, drought-affected crops probably won't set that grain, so it may not occur. The other thing to notice there is the difference between tropical grasses, for example, and temperate grasses, and even temperate legumes. You start at a lower quality, and the rate of decline is generally higher for those tropical species. That's particularly of note at the moment when people are looking to buy roughages to support their enterprise, but they're based on very low quality tropical pastures that may be coming from parts of, for example, West Australia. As a rule, they're low quality and they're really limited in what they can do for you. Protein. We talk protein, crude protein. Essentially, it's just the amount of nitrogen in the feed multiplied by 6.25. Because when you feed a cow or a sheep, you actually don't feed the animal first, you feed the rumen, which is a big vat of bacteria that digests the grass and the grain and everything they consume. And those bacteria need nitrogen. That means some of that forage or grain nitrogen or protein that's consumed needs to be broken back down into nitrogen for utilization. What that means though, or the advantage that we get out of that is, in a drought situation, we can provide nitrogen in the form of urea, provided it's done safely, and that nitrogen for urea is enough for those rumens, microbes, to operate, break down the feed that they're consuming, and get the most energy out of the diet that's available. It allows for a little bit of flexibility. Crude protein content, a couple of other rules. Younger animals generally require more. As production increases, more crude protein is obviously required to lay down muscle. And crude protein content is based as 3 forms: what can be broken down in the rumen, what can't be broken down in the rumen and is utilized later in the tract. And the first one is where things like urea can be assisted. The other one I want to quickly touch on, because every result will have fiber content, and the fiber content will be expressed as neutral detergent fiber and probably acid detergent fiber. Occasionally you might get lignin. As plants mature, the fiber content increases and the digestibility of that fiber content decreases. Now that fiber is made up of components, one of which is lignin, which is essentially indigestible. cellulose, which is partially digestible. Those two together as a detergent fiber. And the third one is hemicellulose, which is fairly well digested. So put the three together and you get neutral detergent fiber. Why is fiber important? Well, in a drought feeding situation, to a large degree, it is not important, provided the basic requirements for some roughage are met. What NDF does, what that fiber content does, is it actually determines intake. And some results will spend, particularly in the dairy industry, they will look carefully at NDF, both in terms of rumen function. A certain amount of fiber is needed to make sure the rumen functions well. Milk production, lactating animals need fiber in their diet to be able to produce butterfat. But over and above that, fiber is basically a limit to intake. In a drought situation, I said for maintenance, it doesn't matter, but you will see it there. Other things that you will see, or you may see in your test, ash content, that's just the mineral content of the feed. As a rule, it isn't important, excepting if it is very, very high. If it is very, very high, it's a sign that there's probably been some soil contamination, in which case you need to check whether it's a real result or whether or not when you've taken a sample, you've contaminated with soil. The problem with high ash content is it effectively reduces metabolizable energy content. It doesn't affect the digestibility of the organic component, but when you put that organic component plus the ash component together, ME declines. Some results will also give you water-soluble carbohydrates, which is starch and starch. These are just sugars and are readily digestible. Obviously, with starch in grain, it's pretty high. Levels of starch in grain can be up around 80% or 80, even 85 in some cases. They are generally a rapid source of energy. Ether extract is the other one that you might sort of come across. Ether extract is basically fat or oil. Where it is important is that high levels of fat in a diet can contribute to an increase in energy. So it is possible to feed energy in the form of fat to increase energy intake in an animal. And that's not uncommon, for example, in some dairy cow diets, because fat has an energy content of about 35 megajoules per kilogram. However, there's a limit of about 3 to 5% of the total diet, otherwise you will damage the rumen function. The other one I really wanted to quickly talk about is heat damaged protein. Sometimes you'll get hay that's been obviously heat damaged, it's got that beautiful caramel smell to it, or it may be a dry silage that hasn't been sealed properly. That is a problem because as it heats, some of the protein may be bound up with fiber, which means both fiber and the protein become less digestible. If you're formatting a diet as close as you can to the meat requirements for protein, and you are feeding a diet that's got a higher level of damaged protein, you need to take that into account. So if you work out that you need 12% protein in your diet to meet the maintenance requirements of the cattle you've got or the sheep, and some of that protein is heat damage, you need to account for that and increase the amount of protein they get. Other people might be trying to source silages. There are a couple of specific silage tests which could be of value, but the main one I think of importance is the ammonia nitrogen. You can have a silage which is high in energy, high in protein, and looks quite good, but if the protein has been degraded to such an extent that a lot of it has been converted to ammonia, then the palatability declines, and as a rule, the more ammonia nitrogen, the lower the less palatable it is, and therefore lower intake. If you're going out to buy feed and you're going to buy silage, it's worth getting a test that also includes ammonia in, because if you want a production feed and ammonia levels are very high, then you probably won't be able to achieve your goals. There's a table there which essentially says that if less than the 5% of the N is in the form of ammonia, you've got a really good, highly palatable silage, and then there are various grades going on from there. They're the main test results you will see. The most important ones I'd just like to reinforce again are dry matter, ME, and crude protein content. In all cases, we strongly recommend that if you are going to buy or source feed, that you get a feed test done so that you know exactly what you're going to receive and what you're able to do with that feed, whether it's purely a low quality roughage or potential for part of a production ration. But sometimes people may want to look around and see what is out there and have a bit of a guide of average quality and for a range of feeds. Now, this is a table that comes, you can access from either the DPI website or it's available in the drought management guide, which the department has put together. It gives you a couple of common feed types and a couple of uncommon feed types and gives you some estimates of quality. This, as I said, this information is available on the web, or if you want to get a copy of the drought management guide, which contains this, you can get it off the web, or you can get a copy of LLS or Rural Councillors. It contains a lot more information other than just this. It will also contain information on predicted feed and minimum crude protein requirements for several classes of animals. In this case, we're talking about merino weaners. Another source of information is to just go on the web and have a look and do a Google search. One site that contains quite a bit of detail about quite a range of feeds is Feedopedia. It, as you can see there on the left-hand side, it's got a range of categories, and it has information on average sort of quality for a number of those. There are other sources. This is the information that comes out of the New South Wales DPI Feed Quality Service, and this is just simply the results for cereal hay, lucerne hay, pasture hay. I really wanted to highlight one major point out of this, and if you look at, for example, that first column there, where you've got DOMD for cereal hay, average of 61.4. DOMD is just digestibility. Second column, that 61.4 equates to an ME of 9.5. But the range you'll note is from 8.2 to 11.8. If we drop down to lucerne, you'll see 8.7, but again, a range from 6.9 to 11.4. Pasture, an even bigger range. If I use grass feed to do some predictions, for example, crossbred lamb, that ME of 9.5 will probably mean that feed is capable of supporting a gain of about 48 grams a day. However, 8.2, you're going to be losing weight. 11.8, your gain is going to be about 171. So be aware that when you source feed, or either from your own farm or from elsewhere, averages such as in the drought management guide or in sources like Feedopedia are a good indicator of what feed types may suit the requirements that you have. But in all cases, the range can be quite huge, and please test, because if you're looking for an ME of 9 and you end up with an ME of 7.5 just because you're at the bottom end for the scale for that type of feed, you'll be sorely disappointed in what you achieve. In terms of other resources that are out there, this is the feed cost calculator, which is on the DPI website. It's just an Excel spreadsheet. It allows you to put a number of feeds in there. You're allowed to put the cost in, the dry matter content, the energy content, and the crude protein content, and that will work out for you a relative proportion of the relative costs in terms of dollars per tonne dry matter, cost cents per megajoule, and megajoules per $100, and then also the protein cost. It gives you a tool which allows you to compare feeds on a common basis in terms of dry matter, ME, and crude protein. One of the other points I'd like to quickly, one of the other points I'd like to really quickly highlight is the value of the quality for conserved forage in terms of ME on drought feeding. Now, I often hear people make comments such as, any feed we can get in a drought is good feed, and I understand that sentiment. And it may be quite justified in terms of if it's just a roughage source and most of the feeding is going to be grain because that's the most economical way to feed the animals. But I'd just like to highlight in this example, both for a cow herd and a ewe flock, if I had hay, for example, with ME content of 7, 9.5, or 12, the ME required by those animals in terms of megajoules per day would change slightly, because as ME content declines, animals actually require more because they're less efficient at getting that available ME out. So we get it. Now, if we assume that all that feed cost was at $350 a tonne, and you work out the amount of feed they require in terms of dry matter and as fed, assuming 90%, what you can see quite clearly there is that if you have to buy feed and they cost the same, increasing ME content from 7 to 12 effectively halves or nearly halves your feeding costs. So please stress again, if you're buying feed, it is critically important to go and test so that you know what quality you've got, and you can assess based on some rational or objective measure like ME. In summary then, I just want to stress a couple of things. Feed tests are critical because they will provide you with the base information about what is the production potential of the feed that you have or you want to buy. And that production potential may simply be for maintenance, but if the ME is below the level required for maintenance, animals will be losing weight and eventually die. That means you're getting the information you require on the suitability of each feed for what your intended purpose is, whether it's just purely to maintain a breeding herd, or you've done your sums and you work out it's actually smarter with some growing stock to production feed, so you don't have to carry them for as long and you get them off the place quickly. The other thing it does is it gives you a basic guide to supplementation that is required to achieve what you want. And the major component there is probably crude protein content. Where your crude protein content is less than required for the ME, your actual utilization of that forage will be depressed. You won't get as much energy out as you would have hoped for its test value. And it also allows you to add protein as you require or other components as you require to meet any production targets you have. In real terms, though, there are some components that it is probably easier to just take a proactive approach. And for that, for example of that would be supplementing grazing crops with minerals that have been shown in the past to be deficient. It's generally a fairly cheap option rather than taking the risk and losing production or worse. And finally, feed tests, and I think it's come through, it's the objective basis which we should all trade feed on. If a person comes to you in the pub and has 2 bales of hay, make sure you get the bale of hay that has the better quality if they're the same price. You need to meet targets for production and then look at the most cheap and economic option that you've got. And I know that's a pretty quick snapshot of feed testing, and stress again the important things: energy, protein, dry matter content, and that if you stick to getting those right and supplement the other things as required, then you're well on your way to being able to feed livestock successfully. Thank you. Over to you, Todd.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, John. That was great. Are there any questions for John? John, I had a question. You mentioned ash content just in passing as the indicator of vitamins and minerals. Does ash content vary between the stages of the plant? And the reason why I ask is a lot of producers, when their stock are feeding, pretty mature grasses, the first thing they will do is put out a vitamin and mineral block. Now, is that justified? Is there any reason to believe that ash content will be less in a mature plant than a young plant, or is it going to be less available as digestibility has gone down, so it is warranted?
It would depend on the feed that you're talking about. I think providing a mineral vitamin block is justified in the sense that dry feeds won't have any vitamins in them anyway, or the vitamin content is probably likely to be depressed. The question is whether that block contains vitamins that are available to that animal.
So otherwise, are you talking about things like A, D, and E there?
A, D, and E in particular, because they're associated with green feed. So you may need to supplement them anyway. In terms of pasture, the content of ash can increase with maturity, but within a pasture type, it doesn't seem to change that much. So as a general rule, pastures will have about 9 to 12% ash. Some of the crops will be around 5 or 6%. And whilst they will accumulate ash as they grow, they also accumulate other organic matter as well. So the proportion doesn't change greatly. There are a couple of ones that I'd call exceptions, like rice straw. And rice straw has been shown to contain up to around 20% or more ash. It's one that is a definite accumulator, particularly of silica. And if people are looking for sources of roughage, and one of the sources that becomes available is rice hulls or rice straw, just be aware that the quality of those is very, very low. And to a large extent, the reason why the quality of those is much lower than, say, cereal straw is the high ash content. So in summary, if you feel you need to supplement. I don't have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you.
For dry, actually, I suppose the other point is, Todd, for dry feeds, the best supplement may in fact be some form of nitrogen if the protein content's down a little bit to be able to maximise the benefit you get out of that dry feed.
Thanks, John. There's a question here. What's the difference between the feed value of grain versus sprouted grain? The obvious one is water content, but are there any other differences? I know there has been some profile about hydroponic systems, and there is a question about it here, John. Did you want to touch on that?
Just briefly, what happens when you sprout grain is you're effectively converting starch into fibers and sugars. So you get a change in the composition of the plant. In terms of the amount of energy per kilogram of dry matter, I would not expect it to change greatly, because you're talking about very immature plants that haven't really reached the point where they're actively photosynthesizing and accumulating additional energy. So what you've got is energy in the stored grain, which is converted to energy in the dry matter, with potentially a little bit more. But the issues that people need to consider is firstly the one that you mentioned, is the high water content, which makes it incredibly difficult to transport or costly to transport. The infrastructure costs of producing that grain are quite high, and needs to be considered in the context of, even if there's 10% more energy, I might be better off to feed 10% more grain. The other risk with hydroponic or sprouted grains is they are prone to getting moldy because of the system, which is warmth and light and humidity. There is a risk, there is some molds develop. They need to be controlled. But if molds are present, they can produce things called mycotoxins. Mycotoxins can do several things. There's thousands of mycotoxins, but the biggest risk is depressed intake. So in a nutshell, my summary is that the sprouted grain system would not be the pathway I would recommend for feeding of stock, large-scale feeding of cattle and sheep.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a couple of comments here saying, you know, how you did a really great job and useful information, so thank you for those comments. There's another comment here from Russ. If the only feed I can get is low ME, so what's low ME hay, John? If you're getting Rhodes grass hay from Queensland, a lot of people are getting that. Okay. What would you consider low ME? Anything under 7, 6.5?
I would consider anything under 7.5 low quality.
Okay.
In terms of, because 7.5 is about that cut-off point below which, depending on the class of animal you're feeding, below about that 7.5, it's sub-maintenance. So an animal simply cannot eat enough of that low quality roughage to support its current live weight. It would be losing weight. Now the question then comes in, if you're losing weight, is that an acceptable weight loss? Or if you want to maintain, you've got to add something else to that feed, usually grain. Now grain is obviously high in energy, and it becomes a case of sums. Sub-maintenance feed, you're losing weight, therefore you're losing value of your animals. You may be able to wear a little bit of that in some situations, some breeding animals or younger animals, but if you're production feeding, obviously you can't. The other bit is, if you're spending $300, $400, $500 a tonne on hay that has got an ME of 6.5, and you can get grain which has got an ME of 12.5 for a similar price, then in terms of the available energy to the animal, grain far outweighs the value of that roughage. So what you need to do is do your sums. Use that drought feed calculator, work out your cents per megajoule, work out, and you get things like the drought management guide and all the rest of it, where they'll give you guidelines about what proportion of roughage to hay you can successfully feed, roughage to grain, and then in that case, my advice is go for as much grain as you can and limit the amount of roughage to what you need.
Thanks, John. You anticipated the second part of that question, which was, okay, if I can only get low ME feed, what strategy is best? Find a high crude protein supplement, and what you're saying is adding a crude protein supplement to low ME feed doesn't actually improve the energy of it. So it sounds like adding crude protein is important only to sort of fix up an imbalance of energy and protein.
And there's another trap there, which I tried to allude to in the crude protein bit. When a feed test comes back, it will tell you what the energy content is in the crude protein content. That energy content is assuming that there is no limits on how much of that is digested. It's assuming that there are no protein limits or mineral limits. So most of those answers would assume the rumen is balanced for everything that it needs. If you've got an ME of 6.5 and you have a protein of 3.5, which is what you can get in some of these roughages, you won't achieve the 6.5 ME that feed test will give you. So you effectively we'll get two things happen. Firstly, the rate of digestion and the amount of digestion will go down, and also intake will be depressed. So your net effect will be 6.5, you might expect to lose 60 grams a day, for example, but in fact you might end up losing a kilo a day.
So in that case, you need both protein and more energy.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, the way I like to think of it, Todd, is energy sets your limit, but then you need to make sure that the protein is balanced for it. There's no value in having protein content above what you require for the energy, because it's usually a more expensive nutrient. But if you have protein content that is substantially less than required, then you're not going to use the available energy to the extent you should.
Okay. Do all labs use the same methodologies? Are there any differences in results from different labs? Thank you, Neil.
I don't know whether I should thank Neil for that or not. Yes and no. Yes, in that if labs use the same methodology, they should get the same results, provided they're proficient at their test. Some can also use different methods, which will give you an identical answer. All labs generally use NIR for commercial feed testing, which is based on what we call wet chemistry, or an actual laboratory test where you use test tubes and chemicals and all the rest of it. So the NIR doesn't change, it's the wet chemistry behind it that can. Within Australia, there is a group called the Australian Fodder Industry Association, who have participating labs who all participate in ring tests to ensure that their results are fairly uniform. Now, my advice is, if you go to one of those, you're going to get an answer where they will all give you a pretty similar answer, and for the same feed, if not identical, and it will be developed for Australian feeds, and I would rely on it. The risk is that if somebody uses an NIR calibration which is developed on feeds which aren't common in Australia, or they're developed overseas and imported, they may or may not give you the same answer. I know anecdotally there are two labs in one state where one's known as the buying lab and one's a selling lab, because there's about a megajoule difference in the answers. Go to the AFIA website. If you choose one of those labs, I think you'll get a lab that will probably give you a reasonable answer, or a reliable answer. It's probably the better way to put it. I would trust those labs. The other thing to do is, if you have over time continually used one lab, and you know that from your own experience that its results either are spot on with what you see in your cattle, or a little bit over or a little bit under, stick to that lab, because then you're basically ranking things based on your past experience. If you've got lab A and someone gives you a result from lab B and you don't know if they're different, unless you can look at, say, the AFIA website, then you're taking a little bit of a punt. But still, in all cases, it's still better off to test than not test, because even if there's a difference in, for example, ME of half a megajoule between the two labs, you're still much better off getting that than not knowing, when you know, you could see from the DPI data, it's not out of the question to get 5 megajoule range in quality for the same feed type.
Thanks,
so
John.
Essentially 0.5% of the potential difference.
Look, there's a couple of questions here about soil and ash content. So I'm not sure, did you mention what you might consider to be a high ash content, John?
No, I didn't. If you look at a crop like maize or sorghum, it's probably about 5 or 6% ash. If you look at pastures, they're probably around the 9 to 12%. If you look at rice, straw, it's probably anywhere between 17 and 23 or 4.
Okay.
But they are they're good ballpark. When we talk digestibility, there's a number of ways we express digestibility. And traditionally in Australia, we have DMD, which is dry matter digestibility, which is just like that diagram that I put up before. But there is another measure called DOMD, which not only accounts for the amount of dry matter they consume, but it accounts for how much of the organic matter they consume is actually digested. And ME is predicted from DOMD more accurately than from DMD. So labs in Australia will use DOMD. Now, what we know is if ash content goes up, but the organic component digestibility does not change, ME will go down. So soil contamination will reduce ME. If it's really there, then it's an issue. If it's not really there and it's contamination because of your sampling, then you need to know that because you're going to underestimate the value of your food, the feed that you test.
I suppose the next question on top of that is, what about silage or grain that might have been stored in a bunker underground and might have some soil in it? Apart from you're saying the impact of reducing the other components like the energy, are there any potential side effects of the ingestion of the soil?
No, not really. Not really. Not as a general rule. There's a few examples where ingestion of soil can be an issue. For example, down where we are here, we're in what they call the anthrax belt. So in droughts, animals lick soil and can get anthrax as a result. But no, I wouldn't be concerned about that. Look, practically, if you're making a bunker, ideally you're going to have a plastic cover so there's not much soil contamination anyway. If you didn't put a cover over the top of it before you put the dirt on, my advice is just be really careful when you take it out, and so you don't mix it all in, and try and remove as much dirt as you can without it. But if you end up with the top couple of inches or foot with a tiny bit of contamination, it's not really going to be an issue. It may reduce the ME a bit, but practically it is the feed resource you've got, so you need to use it, and you need to make sure that even the bits that are a little bit more contaminated get used as well. But the only other comment I'd make is the risk from soil contamination with silage is greater at the time of ensiling because it can contain bacteria that lead to poor fermentation, but that's not an issue here.
Okay, thanks, John. Is it possible to manage lactating beef cows on hay alone? Full drought feeding, no assistance from pasture. That's another question we have.
Well, if I understand the question right, yes, of course it is. You don't. It's analogous to a lot of the more modern dairy systems where in quite intensive feed like dairies or even feed like beef, there is no grazing. Animals are fed a diet in a pen their whole life. Yes, you can. You can formulate a diet.
I think the question is asking, can you do it on hay alone? So, without any grain or without any other supplements. So that would probably come back to your point is, well, depends on the quality of the hay. Depends how fat the cows were when you started feeding, and can they afford to lose some weight?
Exactly. If you're lucky enough to have some clover hay with an ME of 10.5, 11, you're laughing. But if it's 6.5, obviously you can't.
Okay, thank you, John. Can bore water supply vitamins and minerals?
Not vitamins that I'm aware of. No vitamins that I'm aware of. Some minerals maybe, but I don't know of. Look, I'm not really, I don't have very much knowledge about that. My advice is that if you've got bore water, you can get it tested to see whether the minerals in it do meet levels that you may require. You may not require minerals. I mean, you might be feeding something where it's not an issue anyway. And a lot of cases, that's as it is. I'd be a little bit more inclined to test the bore water to see if it has any negative effects in too many minerals, which could have adverse effects on livestock production. Now, off the top of my head, I can't recall the details in it, but I know that the department has, and I think it's on the drought website, has information specifically about water quality and drought feeding.
Yep, no, we've just
Are you aware of that?
Yeah, we just updated that prime fact, and actually, what if bore water is high in salt, then that can have a negative impact on supplements. If you're trying to feed or get urea into stock via a salt-based loose lick, and they're getting a lot of salt in the water, then they just won't take to the loose lick. So again, I suppose it is important to know what kind of minerals might be in your bore water.
Yeah, and the department has, and there are other places as well that can provide those tests.
There's a couple of questions here about whether a copy of your slides might be available, John. One thing I will say is that there would be a recording of the webinar. John, are you happy to have a PDF copy of your slides sent out? I know we did get a request prior to the webinar because some people didn't have enough grunt in their NBN to actually log into the webinar.
Yeah, look, it's all fine with me. I don't think there's any great secrets in there.
Yeah, so look, if you would like a copy of John's slides, then send that email to Livestock Systems, and I will get that out to you. I'm just going to change presenter now, show my screen. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that there is a handout available. If you go down in your screen on the right hand side, you'll see here there's a handout, funny feed analysis. So that is some average and a range of crude protein and energy figures that John had mentioned relating to some of the unusual feeds, particularly fruits and vegetables and their products that producers might be contemplating feeding, and also the dry matter content, which is also very important in determining the overall value and quality of what you might be feeding. So again, if you have more information there, then please call or email John, or the Livestock Systems email address will also get through to me.
Todd, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Just on that, something that you and I talked about the other day, which I forgot to mention, which you brought up, is really important. If people are going down some of those funny feeds, their background is a bit out of the ordinary, please make sure that you test them, but also make sure there's no risk, for example, of residues. Some of the products from, say, vegetable growing and things like that potentially have risk of chemical residues and things like that. They're often unbalanced in terms of their protein, energy, and minerals. And sometimes be aware that things like breads and flour and that are essentially grains that have already been ground up, and so they can be very hot. So there is a risk, or an increased risk, of acidosis in terms of some of those feeds, particularly from the feed industry. Yeah, sorry about that, Tom.
No, that's great. Thank you. So look, seems like there's no more questions. So what I would like to draw attendees' attention to is we had a couple of requests about how to salvage frosted or drought-affected crops. So things like cutting and drying time to maximise quality. Should producers be making hay or silage, or even putting stock on there? Like, what's going to is the best option? nitrates or other things that might, that producers might need to be aware of. And so we're going to look to have that webinar sometime during the week of the 17th of September. And just speaking to John earlier, maybe the morning of the 20th of September, we'd like to have a webinar on that. So look, if you are interested in registering for that webinar and you're not currently on our subscription list, then send an email to that address there, the Livestock Systems address, and I will subscribe you for that upcoming webinar. The other thing I would draw your attention to is in July, Brett Littler from Central Tablelands LLS delivered an excellent webinar on drought feeding pregnant and calving cows. It covers a lot of the information that John has talked about today, but relates even more so to the kind of feeds that are available. So if you think you'd like to look at that webinar, it is just do a search for drought feeding pregnant and calving cows. It's a YouTube video. There's also a link to it on the New South Wales DPI Drought Hub. Is there any? I don't have any more notifications of things coming up. So look, thanks very much, John. That was very informative talk, and thanks for taking your time out of your schedule to put it together. And maybe we'll hear from you in a couple of weeks talking about salvaging frosted and droughted crops. Thanks very much, everybody.